What about salvation? By grace through faith. The Bible says that salvation is a gift and cannot be earned by works. All that is necessary is belief in the gospel. For by grace you've been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves is the gift of God, not of works, lest anyone should boast. Now to him who works, the wages are not counted as grace, but as debt. But to him who does not work, but believes on him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is accounted for righteousness. What does Joseph Smith say? Works are necessary for salvation. We believe that through the atonement of Christ, all mankind may be saved by obedience to the laws and ordinances of the gospel. All right, so that, I think, is enough to show that, well, the God of Joseph Smith is not the God of Moses and the rest of the prophets. Well, that's how you test it. God said, even if what he says comes to pass, if he leads you after gods you have not known, this is not a prophet of God. That's exactly what he's doing. What about false prophecies? He made a number of false prophecies. The specifics of some of these, I can give you the materials, but I don't take the time to do all of it here just because of, among other things, it would just take a long time. But he makes a specific prophecy about how the Book of Mormon, once it was written, the copyright would be sold in Canada. Now, it did not get sold, and not only did the prophecy he made not come to pass, Joseph Smith talks about the fact that that prophecy didn't come to pass. So this is not one of these where, well, yeah, it actually did, we just lost all the records. No, because he was confronted by his contemporaries. Well, wait a minute, I thought you said that God said that I was supposed to go to Canada and sell the copyright, and I went, and it didn't get sold, so what happened? And Joseph's like, I don't know, let me go ask the Lord what went wrong. And then he's like, well, you know, sometimes these things come from God, sometimes they don't. That was his answer. It's like sometimes these prophecies they just aren't from God. You just go, dude, what are you talking about? Now all of a sudden I got to start picking and choosing your prophecies? False prophecy about the coming of the Lord. He makes several prophecies about when the Lord would come back, and of course that hasn't happened. Probably his most famous is a false prophecy about the Civil War. Mormons like to make a big deal out of the fact that he seemingly was prescient enough to even anticipate a civil war. But all you've got to do is look at contemporary literature in the mid-19th century. Everybody was worried about, I mean, do you realize secessionist talk started with Jefferson in 1800? Thomas Jefferson was one of the first people who began to advocate a dissolution of the federal government. He decided maybe we can make this work. So by the time Joseph Smith comes along in the middle of the 19th century and he starts speculating that this thing may escalate to armed conflict, a lot of people were already thinking that way. That was sort of the kind of the ambience of the day, because tensions were continually escalating between the states in the north and the states in the south. Not only just slavery, but it was probably even more volatile were maritime trade laws, because the South was no longer buying textile from the northern states. They were starting to buy it from Europe, and because they could get it cheaper. And that got the northern states mad because they were losing this income, and they were trying to impose maritime tariffs and thing, ironically, sort of like what King George had done to precipitate the American Revolution. The whole thing was repeated. Now the northern states and the southern states were embroiled in a controversy over who has jurisdiction over maritime laws and tariffs and these kind of things, and that fed what was already a volatile situation over the more emotionally charged issue of slavery. I mean, that was there too. Whitmer talks about other false prophecies that Joseph Smith made. Notice, though, when Whitmer says these things, he doesn't even take it as an argument that Joseph Smith's not a prophet or that the Book of Mormon is not from God. I don't know that he ever departed from that. He never repudiated his belief that the Book of Mormon was divinely inspired. But he did acknowledge that Joseph Smith made other false prophecies, and he did think that Joseph had gone beyond what he should have done with all of these visions and things. All right, so let me give then, in the last about 20 minutes or so, responses directly to these arguments that I first enumerated at the beginning of last week when we started this presentation. So I'll remind you of their argument, and then I'll just give a quick response. So these are the inferential arguments for Joseph Smith being a prophet via the, quote, authenticity of the Book of Mormon. Remember, if you know the Book of Mormon is true, then you know the guy through whom it came is of God. And then whoever that guy is a prophet of God. Whatever he writes is from God, and then whatever he's, and then you got Mormonism. So these sort of inferential arguments. The first one, Mormons claim that Joseph Smith lacked the education and access to information to be able to fabricate a work of the caliber of the Book of Mormon. Responses. Others in Joseph Smith Jr.'s day did similar works. As I mentioned earlier, this story of Joseph Smith is not unique. In fact, probably one of the most famous is James Jesse Strange. Here's what he said. A revelation he received in September 1845. The angel of the Lord came to me, James, on the first day of September in the year 1845, and the light shined around him above the brightness of the sun, and he showed unto me the plates of the sealed record he gave into my hands in the Urim and Thummim, exactly like Joseph Smith. And out of the light came a voice of the Lord saying, My servant James, in blessing I will bless thee, should be two E's. Behold the record which was sealed from my servant, should be a space there, Joseph. I'm not a prophet of God either, am I? Yes, bad grammar. That's another thing that you know a false prophet. Unto thee it is reserved, so shalt thou translated unto them. I ellipsed that because he's talking about these other people. He's going to be translating these things unto these people. That should be go to the place. Sorry, this was like hastily typed out. So, go to the place which the angel of the presence shall show and dig up the record from my people. Now, the backstory of this is that James Strang had become associated with Joseph Smith about 3 months after things got started, and he immediately escalated to this prominent role as elder of the church, and things were going along fine with him until there was a power struggle between him and Brigham Young after Smith died, because Strang claimed that, well, God told me I'm supposed to take over the church. And Brigham Young's like, no, I'm supposed to. And of course, others were saying, well, it's supposed to be Joseph's son that's supposed to take over. And in fact, he tried to produce a document that said Joseph wrote this letter before he died. And it says right here, hey, give it to Jesse. Give the ball to Jesse. No. And so only few people went with him. The majority of them went with Brigham Young. They end up migrating westward to Utah. The rest is history. A small group follow Strang up to Wisconsin. And then that's where he has this vision when he's at Wisconsin. Now there's a different hill in Wisconsin that he goes and gets plates, golden plates, Urim and Thummim, translate, that kind of stuff. Some of the witnesses were part of that movement as well for a while, of the Book of Mormon. Some of the same witnesses were included with the Strang movement. It eventually fizzles out. We're not sitting around doing a Sunday night thing on Strangism, or the Strangites as they were called in that day. Nobody's talking about that because it just fizzled. Joseph's scam didn't fizzle. It caught on and then took on a life of its own, and now we're having to contend with it as we're doing. Much of the Book of Mormon, so this point is, what are you going to do if Joseph Smith is so special because he wrote the Book of Mormon? What about what Strang and his story and all the stuff that he fabricates? And there are actually others besides Strang. There was about 11 stories of people that had these kind of things all right around the same time. Much of the Book of Mormon is actually almost verbatim out of the King James Bible, which is an interesting thing because if it's translated from Reformed Egyptian into mid-19th century American English, how did it become Elizabethan English? Where did you get the these and the thous and the shouts? Where did that come from? Because nobody talks that way in middle 19th century America. So if you're going from Egyptian, well, they didn't have Elizabethan English and Egyptian, to 19th century English, how come you have this King James English? Well, he just lifts large segments out of the King James Bible into his. Some of the material of the Book of Mormon is evidently borrowed from the Apocrypha, like the name Nephi comes out of 2 Maccabees. Contents of the Book of Mormon reflects the theological times in which Joseph Smith Jr. lived, including discussions about current theological issues as infant baptism, ordination, the Trinity. These were all big controversies. In fact, the history of Christianity in America in 19th century America is, besides these aberrant groups, just what was going on with the Restoration movement, Alexander Campbell, which we now know as the Church of Christ, Disciples of Christ, that group that all came out of this same geographic area, largely, same time, largely. You've got that going on. You've got Mary Baker Eddy going on. You've got the Fillmores. You've got the whole New Thought movement. There's just so much volatile religious upheaval in New England in the second half of the 19th century. And so the Book of Mormon and other things that Smith writes reflects the milieu in which he found himself. This deserves a treatment all on its own. I'm just going to gesture at it. But the Book of Mormon, in fact, Mormonism has a very conspicuous Masonic influence. Joseph Smith was a Mason. The Mormon temple ritual, he stole a lot of stuff for the Mormon temple ritual. He stole it from the Masons. Some of it is almost exactly the same. If you know what the Masonic ritual is, and that's pretty much public knowledge too, although I think some Masons would be surprised to know that. But I've got the Masonic temple ritual on tape, video, done by a worshipful master who carries you all the way through the Masonic temple ritual. Well, you ought to see that and then read what the Mormon temple ritual is like, including the garments that you wear, the gestures that you make, and these vows that you take. He's just ripping off Masonry is all he's doing. It didn't take any imagination. And I'm not making a value judgment about the legitimacy of Masonry. I'm just saying there was nothing special about what Joseph Smith did. He's just stealing and borrowing and being influenced by everything going on around him. Intense interest over the origins of the Native Americans characterized Joseph Smith Jr.'s time, particularly the view that the American Indians were descendants of the ancient Hebrews, as you've heard me talk about last time. And I've already talked about the manner of the translation here. All right, let's get through this quickly because I got to get to the punchline. Mormons argue that the Book of Mormon was predicted by the Bible. And they talk about the stick of Judah and the stick of Joseph. But the stick of Judah and the stick of Joseph and the other prophets, let me do this one let me do it in this order because I think that's why I have it here. The other sheep, rather. I was going them in the reverse order. Jesus' reference to the other sheep, because he's talking about there are going to be these other sheep that come along, has nothing to do with the peoples of the North American continent to whom Jesus supposedly appeared. Remember, after he raised from the dead, he goes to the Americas. The other sheep is Jesus is talking about the relationship of the nation Israel and the Gentiles, because it wasn't clear to the Jews that the Gentiles were going to be part of the new covenant. It wasn't obvious, and it probably wouldn't have been obvious to many of us either at the time. And then the stick of Judah and the stick of Joseph, they argue, are the writings of Joseph Smith and the Bible that come together. Has nothing to do with that. Talks about God's plan that he had for the divided kingdom of Israel, between Israel and Judah. Third argument, or Mormons argue that no evidence such as archaeological historical evidence exists, so any argument based on archaeology fails. So this is sort of their response. This is sort of a negative argument, saying you don't have any, you can't disprove it archaeologically, so at worst, we're just at zero. There is archaeological evidence. Incontrovertible archaeological evidence militates against the authenticity of the Book of Mormon's evidence from the document from the Smithsonian, for example. That Smithsonian institution gets a lot of inquiries. This is their standard letter. My brother Don, my oldest brother Don, he actually wrote the Smithsonian, and this is what he got. Your recent inquiry concerning the Book of Mormon has been received in the Smithsonian Department of Anthropology. The Book of Mormon is a religious document, not a scientific guide. The Smithsonian Institution does not use it in any way in archaeological research. Because the Smithsonian Institution receives many inquiries in this regard in connection with the Mormon statements about the origin and relationships of the American Indians, we have prepared a statement regarding the Book of Mormon, a copy of which is enclosed for your information. I just want to point out a couple of things here. Smithsonian archaeologists see no connection between the archaeology of the New World and the subject matter of the Book of Mormon. We know of no authentic cases of ancient Egyptian or Hebrew writing having been found in the New World, which is what he claimed he found in the Golden Plates. Reports of findings of Egyptian influence in the Mexican and Central American areas have been published in newspapers and magazines from time to time, but thus far no reputable Egyptologist has been able to discover any relationship between Mexican remains and those in Egypt. In fact, here's one thing I'll warn you about. If you let the missionaries come into your home and you get into this subject about archaeology in the Book of Mormon, they will want to show you a video, which they showed me, called Ancient America Speaks. And if you're not careful, you'll be tricked into thinking all of this archaeological evidence about Mesoamerica, the Aztecs and the Incas and all that, has nothing to do with the Book of Mormon. These are like centuries later that all occurred. But they don't tell you that. They just show you, look at all these things we found, look at these coins. And the unwary watches that and just assumes, okay, well, this then apparently corroborates what the Book of Mormon. But if you listen closely, they go, now, this isn't Book of Mormon coins. These aren't Book of Mormon stuff. But look how cool it really is. He's like, well, it has nothing to do with your story, though. It's really, I think deceptive. At any rate, so I can get you a copy of that, or you can probably get it off the internet pretty easily. The fact that no archaeological evidence supported the Book of Mormon, that there is no archaeological evidence, is frankly admitted by some Mormon archaeologists. I'll show you something here in a moment in a different context. There is no such language as Reformed Egyptian, by the way. And there are also other anachronisms. You've got French words in the Book of Mormon. You go, how did it go from Reformed Egyptian to 19th century English to French? How do you have characters in the Book of Mormon speaking French if it was written in Egyptian in the New World? How did the French get in there? This is the most important one. This is the one I wanted to make sure I got to, and I did. So now I feel good about myself. This is the punchline. In fact, it's such a punchline I have to take a sip of dihydrogen monoxide. Watch that picture show up on the scrolling things. So the most important, quote, argument that Mormons offer to prove that Joseph Smith Jr. is a prophet of God is a subjective argument. That is internal feeling inside, not something external and public and objective. No matter what objective evidence can be brought against the authenticity of the Book of Mormon addressed in the above arguments, this subjective test always overrides it. Thus, ultimately, Mormons feel no obligation to try to answer the incontrovertible evidence against Joseph Smith Jr., the Book of Mormon, and other scriptures and Mormonism. In other words, they say, look, all I ask you to do is just take a Book of Mormon, read it, and ask God if it's true. Just pray and ask God. And if you have a sincere heart, He'll show you whether it's true or not. I mean, how fair could that be? And then what happens? Well, they will say what happened to them. If you ask them, will you bear me your testimony? Yes. I prayed and I asked God, and He showed me inside, by the power of the Holy Spirit, that this is true. I know it in my knower. Okay? That's how I know. And there's nothing that can disabuse me of that, seemingly. John Clark is a professor of anthropology at BYU. This is a newsletter written through the university. Look at a couple of excerpts that he says here. Clark summed up LDS view, that's Latter-day Saint view of archaeology. If the claims made by the Book of Mormon are confirmed through archaeology, then the claims are true, the Book of Mormon is true, Joseph Smith was a true prophet, and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is true. Now, first of all, that is what is known in logic as the fallacy of non sequitur. That means in Latin, it does not follow. It absolutely doesn't follow that if I say that Cumming is north of Alpharetta, and then I go to say anything else I want about God, that because it's true that I got some archaeological thing true, like Cumming is north of Alpharetta, that everything else that I say is true. That doesn't follow at all. So even if it was the case that the archaeology corroborated the story in terms of the physical stuff, that just means that it can't be contradicted by archaeology, but it doesn't mean that it shows that the theology of the Book of Mormon is true necessarily. I mean, just because, even if you could show there were Nephites and Lamanites, it doesn't mean Jesus showed up and there's no archaeological evidence for that. You don't have his footprint in the rock like they do of Muhammad, supposedly. You don't have Jesus' footprints left behind. So that's just not true, first of all. But that isn't as bad as it gets. Even though Clark endorsed the study of archaeology to prove certain facts of the Book of Mormon as true, he emphasized to students and faculty the importance of relying on Christ and faith to develop a testimony. That is code for this subjective feeling. That's exactly what that is. Every Mormon reading that knows exactly what he's talking about. Irrespective of what anybody says about the authenticity or lack thereof of any fact, this internal feeling I've got confirms it for me to be true. And as I suggested a few weeks ago, if you talk to, and this is not only true of Mormons, I think it's true of a lot of the cults, if you talk to them in a way that they start feeling disturbed by what you're saying, then the disturbed feeling that they get, they interpret that as satanic or demonic. So they instantly will go away. That's why they left last week, I think. Or not last week, but a few weeks ago. Or at least, that's not why they left, because they left because it was over. As I think about it. Oh, yeah. You didn't hang around. But they didn't stay around to talk. Despite, I mean, they talked a little bit. I think Clayton talked to, but I mean, and of course, we get run out pretty quickly. We got to lock it. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, there's the afterglow, the fifth quarter, as they used to call it. But I was just struck by, they wouldn't talk to me. I tried to get them there. I'm trying to introduce myself and give them my card, and they're walking away from me while I'm talking to them. And they're like, It's like, well, why? Because it's an internal thing that they're relying on, not PowerPoints and archaeological. They go. So this commentary by one who heard his talk, Benjamin Boster, a junior, majoring in arts, respected Clark's take on the subject. Quote, I like how he said that certain things that show evidence for the Book of Mormon, but it's not necessarily what we based our testimony on. It just adds to the truth. So I like the fact that, well, when the chips are down, I don't really have to, it doesn't have to pass the smell test when it's all over with. So what about this subjective experience? Well, I submit to you that it's insufficient to adjudicate truth claims. You don't, he read James 5:1, and when James 5:1 says, if any man lacks wisdom, let him ask of God. He thinks somehow that meant, if you're confused about whether this theological group or that theological group is true, go ask God and He'll tell you which one's true. That's not the way to decide theological truth. I mean, that's just ridiculous. What do you get when you get that? You get Mormonism and stuff like that. You open yourself up to all kinds of deception. Besides that, why should it be that if God was going to confirm to me and I read the Book of Mormon, why would I expect God to confirm the truth of the Book of Mormon through some feeling? What if I said, and I've actually wanted to do this with a Mormon, to say, look, okay, I'll pray and ask God if the Book of Mormon is true. And I'm going to ask God, if the Book of Mormon is true, let the blue sky turn green for 30 seconds. And then if it doesn't turn green, I know it's false. And he would rightfully, and not surprisingly, object to that and say, well, wait a minute, you can't set the test, something silly like that, and say, if the Book of Mormon is true, the sky's going to turn green. I go, well, but that's what you've done tacitly. You've said, God, show me whether this is true, and then you've just interpreted whatever feeling you got as God. You go, why should you think that's any more legitimate than the sky turning green for 30 seconds? That is, where did God tell you, hey, here's how you're going to know, you're going to get this feeling? In fact, that's not even what James is talking about, is he? He's not even talking about theological truth. He's talking about how to have wisdom in suffering, and he's talking to believers in the first place. He's not talking to unbelievers as here's how you know where my truth is. Because you look at 1 John, he gives you some better insights. Here's how you know the truth of God. Anybody who listens to us, meaning the apostles, those are the people that are from God. If they don't go along with what we say, then they're not of God. So as I suggested, the proper way to adjudicate these kind of matters for a prophet has to do with his doctrine. Does it line up with revealed truth? And his false prophecies. And I think on both accounts, then Joseph Smith fails the test of a prophet. And if he fails the test of a prophet, then Mormonism is false.